Okay, everyone. This is going to be an important episode. I would say a fundamentally life-changing episode for me. And I never did this count of the generations in the Matthew lead up to the virgin birth of Jesus, supposedly in the version we all have in the King James and all the Bibles since that time. So we're going to have a shock to our systems. That's all I can tell you. um, when you take the time to just look at this and do the count. Now, Augustine actually heard the arguments, and then he's going to try to address them in a way that would deflect them without telling his audience correctly what the arguments are being made. So it's very tricky what he's trying to do. He never directly quotes his opponent's arguments, but he then lets you think he's addressing their full arguments. And this basically, it's going to be a straw man fallacy he's using here. He's never telling you exactly what they're saying. But once you don't accept what he's saying and you go double check if Augustine's telling you the truth, you'll find out he's lying to you. So, and these are strong claims. I know they're very strong. They're super strong because they're super true. And so let me give you this. So the title of this episode is Augustine's fraudulent arguments about the narrative leading up to the virgin birth came from an inspired source. This is what he's insisting, and this is to preclude that the virgin to ever believe the virgin birth account that is immediately at the end of this is itself equally fraudulent. Now, I want to be clear. I've made the proposition. I believe that Matthew's inspired, the true Matthew. Okay. But this portion, originally, even the critics of the Ebionites agreed that their Matthew didn't even have a genealogy. That was the first earliest account, that the Hebrew Matthew didn't have one. And just so you know, that makes sense because there was absolutely no question that Jesus was of the Davidic heritage, because everybody, even in Israel, had accepted James. I don't know if you know the story of James, his brother. He was allowed to go do the sacrifice, even though he wasn't a Levite priest, but because he was the lineage of David, the Jews all let him, this very just man, go and do the sacrifice because they didn't really like the Herodian appointee high priest. So they would let him go do it. And that's how high they honored him. So there was clearly a recognition that Jesus was a Davidic heir without regard to, somebody writing down a story of generations. And my theory is, to put it on the table, is that Marcion, the heretic who was trying to destroy the Jesus of our Bible, but make Paul more important than Jesus and have a new Jesus who's completely an ascended Jesus who's has these totally different doctrines than the Jesus of earth. And that then he worked with, there's a very famous Marcionite who also translated the Hebrew Bible, the original Bible, meaning the laws and prophets, into Greek. So here we have an expert who knows how to translate Hebrew into Greek, and the Hebrew Matthew is going to be translated into Greek by, I believe this is Theodosian, I think his name is, I'm pretty sure that's Theodosian. And so he does that professionally. That's his living. And he lives in the same city with Marcion, and he's a Marcionite. What's the chance that the two of them thought, hey, let's just let's take a drive in our cart over to Caesarea, where that Hebrew Matthew is, and say, can we just look at it and make a translation? And nobody would think it was of any significance, but they're going to actually change this very first part and plant a couple of seeds. And one of them would be that Jechonias would be in the line of Jesus, which would block Jesus from being a Davidic heir. And so that's something that there's a bomb in there for that. But now the other bomb is that whoever wrote this is completely uninspired because they can't do math. And Matthew is supposed to be a tax collector, and he can't do any math. And he Okay, and I just want to kind of recreate how I found this, because I was not looking for this at all. I was trying to find sermon 169 of Augustine, and so I was looking around and I found this book called Sermons for Christmas and Epiphany. So I wanted to look up what was his sermon on Epiphany. And this is a book from 1952 by Newman Press. And so I'm looking for the Epiphany. And as I'm doing that, I see, well, he has a little lesson about Christmas too. So it's St. Augustine's Sermons for Christmas and Epiphany. It's part of this book series, Ancient Christian Writers, The Works of the Fathers, edited by Quaston and Palumpe, Catholic University. And that should be, let me see the year on that. No, it says number 15. It really doesn't ever give the year. Oh, 1952. And then it has this 1. And then I'm presuming this is sermon number 51, and that's why it says that. And then it's talking of agreement of the evangelists Matthew and Luke in the Lord's genealogy. And so that's not really of interest to me. But then I read this, and it was interesting. At page 29, it says, in endeavoring to understand the Gospels, it is safe to hold that they contain no discrepancies, which is true. You want to take that position. But he's basically going to say if there is a discrepancy, then there must be some hidden meaning behind it. And so that's not the answer. The answer is to find out why there's a discrepancy. If you can reconcile them, great. And now he's dealing with opponents, and he doesn't tell you the real arguments really very precisely. He just says they're basically enemies. They're deluded and they're like Judas's, but they serve a good purpose because they make us think. So I just want to give you a little flavor of this ridicule and basically demonizing your opponent before you even let him speak. Say what you wish, they say. We find that where you read that Christ was born, the Gospels disagree with one another, and two things which disagree cannot both be true. When I point out the disagreement, it is said, I am right in rejecting the faith, or else do you, who accept the faith, show that there is agreement. So now he's saying these people are saying these contradictions exist to disagree with the faith. So these are opponents to the faith of Christ. How about whether they could maybe believe that they don't believe in the faith that you have about something about the faith? So he doesn't go into it. So we don't know the real true argument because he's never telling us what this discrepancy is precisely. And what disagreement, I ask, is it that you will point out? A patent one, he replies, one which no one can contradict. All right, so after Augustine has demonized his opponents, he's going to finally tell us their position at page 35. What then is it that these people say? If I discover a false statement, says one, surely you will refuse to believe the whole account. So he's claiming that if he had to give in that one little error is wrong, one thing is wrong, the entire account is wrong. Well, I don't think anybody could say that, but you could say whoever wrote this genealogy, which is a clearly distinct, different section from anything else in the opening, that person is not inspired. Whoever did this, okay, and it's an entire whole thing you could just simply remove, and you would have no need for it. We'll talk about that later. So anyway, then he says, find such a case, let us see it. So this is him responding to this aggressive person. And then the aggressive person says, I shall count the generations. So now we finally get the idea that there's something allegedly wrong with the generations. And then he calls it a misrepresentation. Thus, by their misrepresentation, those people challenge us and bring us to this. But if we live virtuous lives, if we keep our belief in Christ, this isn't that important, is what he's implying. And then he's going to say, these people are useful, but they're useful the same way the traitor Judas was. So they're like traitors, but if they make us think harder, that's not a bad thing. And then it just continues on that. You just all kinds of throwing every kind of scurrilous thing you can at this, so that you are predisposed to hate the people who are involved here, and you don't even want to hear their arguments. And he, of course, hasn't told you them correctly, and he's going to call them lying adversaries. I mean, every trick in the book to fool you, because he's fooling you. This is what it is. He has to know he's wrong. And then he gets to the name of the generations. It's going to show you the solution, he thinks. If Jechonias is counted twice, 3 times 14 generations are found in Matthew. So he's giving you the answer. I've solved this already. So I've solved your problem. And then he says, the way this is counted in what's upcoming, he's going to say, note that Matthew numbers the generations and says that from Abraham to David, there are 14 generations, and from David to the transmigration to Babylon, 14 generations, and from the transmigration to Babylon to Christ, 14 generations. Multiply 14 by 3, you get 42, but they count the generations and find 41. So they're saying it's one off, okay? And they bring up sophistries and ridicule and scoff. Okay, well, he's going to have to eat his words, but he's not going to tell you. He knows he's wrong. Okay, and I'll show you what I mean. It's very simple. Now then, what does this mean? The fact that in the gospel it is said that there are 3 times 14 generations, but when all are counted together, there are not 42, but 41. So he's restating their position, but he's not telling you how they reason it and where they find the problem. And he says it's a great mystery. He thanks God for these malignant critics. But I'm going to show you, we are producing a spectacle for your mind. So that's where he's now launching into his argument. And wait till you see his first proposition. Right off the bat, lies. He just simply says, so then Abraham to David, there are 14 generations. Then count begins this with Solomon, for David begot Solomon, and beginning with Solomon. So he's going to claim the problem is only in the second and third group of 14. And he's just ignoring that. He just said Abraham to David did 14, and he doesn't even ask anything about that. That's where the problem is, first and foremost. It also exists in the third component. But let me just show you, he himself admits the problem. It's right here in his own page 31 and 32. He has the generations of the first group, okay, from David to, what does he say? David, from Abraham to David. So from Abraham to David, how many generations is that according to you? Your own work here. Let us, as it were, say to Matthew, well, then prove what you say. I am looking for the family lineage of Jesus. Abraham, right? Abraham there to David, right? How many generations? 1. Abraham says begot Isaac. 2. Isaac begot Jacob. 3. Jacob begot Judas and his brethren. 4. Judas begot Phares and Zerah of Thamar. 5. And Phares begot Ezron. 6. Ezron begot Aram. 7. And Aram begot Amminadab. 8. And Amminadab begot Nason. 9. And Nason begot Salmon. 10. And Salmon begot Booz and of Rahab. 11. And Booz begot Obed of Ruth. 12. And Obed begot Jesse. 13. And Jesse begot David the king. Boom. 13 generations. Right there is your missing one. But how did he handle this? This is his own book. I'm taking his own words. He knows it. He just even typed it just 2-3 pages earlier. And yet he just starts to, it launches. I'm going to give you a spectacle for your minds. And the first thing he does is he tells you a lie. And he doesn't do what he's supposed to do. He's supposed to say, if these people are claiming one is off, I'm going to show you there's not one missing. And he's not telling you where they said the one was missing. He's just not informing you, and then he's just hiding the ball. But he's also wrong on the next two. The third one is also wrong. It's 13 as well. But that's a different point. But he knows, I believe he knows it's right here, because why didn't he count? Because it's right in front of him, and he's put it already in this epistle or this sermon, whatever it is. Okay, so he's wrong right off the bat. And we can double check it if you want. 1, Abraham got, this is from King James, a text copy, right from the Bible Hub. 1, Abraham begat Isaac. 2, Isaac begat Jacob. 3, Jacob begat Judas and his brethren. 4, Judas begat Phares and Zerah of Thamar. 5, Phares begat Ezram. 6, Ezram begat Aram. 7, Aram begat Amminadab. 8, Amminadab begat Nason. 9, Nason begat Salmon. 10, Salmon begat Booz of Rechab. And 11, Booz begat Obed of Ruth. And 12, Obed begat Jesse. And 13, Jesse begat David the king. Period. And then we're into the next series, which is David to the arrival of being carried away to Babylon. Okay, so that's proof positive that he's wrong. From David from Abraham to David. So we're only counting to when David arrived. David arrives at when? Jesse begat David. There it is. There's no dispute. So he's wrong, right? And that means whoever wrote this is wrong. Okay, so now we're going to look at the next one. And the next one, no dispute. There's 14 generations. You can count them all, beginning with David. Starting with David. David is once. He has a son named Solomon. Solomon has a son named Robam. And then 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. And Josias begat Jechonias and his brethren about the time they were taken away to Babylon. And so what's the next series according to this? David to the carrying away unto Babylon. And there's 14 generations. So the second group is correct. So the first group is missing one and is wrong. and says it's 14. It's right here in allegedly inspired scripture. It's 14. Abraham to David are 14. No, they're not. It's 13. Okay, so that's false. And now it's going to be false again in the third group. So let me just show you something here. Okay, so now we're going to look at the second group and how are we supposed to count that? So this is Matthew 1:17. We've broken that down for easily reading. So the second group is from David until the carrying away into Babylon, our 14 generations. We have no problem with that. That's correct. You can see that over here. If we go back to our text here. So we go to 1. So the 13 brought it to David. Why was that? Because the message is that all the generations from Abraham to David are 14. And we see we get to David by 13. So there was an error so far. Now it starts up with David to the carrying away unto Babylon. And so we see that begins in not verse, but it begins with David here, where it's marked 1. David, the king, begat Solomon. And then when we go all the way down to the last one in the list, which is Josias begat Jechonias, that says it's about the time they were carried away to Babylon. And that ends at the end of verse 11. So we'd have to count from David giving birth to Solomon as the first step. And the last step, about the time they arrive in Babylon, is 14 generations. And we can show you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. And that's accurate. So that's what he said. It's 14 generations from David, right? Let's make sure we got that right. From David until the carrying away. So the carrying away is here, about the time they were carried away. So verse 12 is a completely different time, which is after they were brought to Babylon. So they've been carried away. Now they're in Babylon. And what's the next generation? That's what this is about. After that point in time that they've arrived and they were brought to Babylon, what's the next generation? And that next generation is Jechonias begat Sembalathiel. And when you count that to the end, you get only 13 generations. So I'll show you that. After they were brought to Babylon, 1, Jechonias begat Salathiel. That's 1. 2, Salathiel begat Zorobabel. 13, verse 13. 3, Zerubbabel begat Abiud. 4, Abiud begat Eliakim. 5, Eliakim begat Azor. 6, Azor begat Zadok. 7, Zadok begat Achim. 8, Achim begat Eliud. 9, Eliud begat Eleazar. 10, Eleazar begat Matan. 11, Matan begat Jacob. And 12, Jacob begat Joseph, the husband of Mary. And then you have to presume there's some generation there, but it's allegedly from Mary. This is the virgin birth. So 13 is virgin birth, but a miscount. It said 14, right? From the carrying away into Babylon unto Christ are 14 generations. But this is where the claim of Augustine is that if you count Jechonias twice, if you counted it twice, 3 times 14 generations are found in Matthew. Well, he's wrong as to the first group, right? That first group is 13 no matter what he does. Second group is 14. Is the fourth group going to be repaired if you added Jechonias? Well, of course, if you add it, but that would violate the language of the text because this Jechonias is about the time they were carried away to Babylon, which matches this verse 17, which says this has to be from David until the carrying away into Babylon. So now you would count from the carrying away into Babylon unto Christ as for whether it's 14 generations or not. And would it be proper to actually count Jechonias again? That seems to be discordant. And also it's the word from implies that this is from a time period after you've arrived Okay, the other one was until the time you have arrived, until the carrying away into Babylon. So when they were taken away to Babylon, carried away, they haven't arrived there yet. This is what happens right around that time. They're being carried away. They're not even in Babylon. So then once they're carried away to Babylon, now we have a new chapter, and that chapter has 13 generations. So we'll show you that so you can see the mathematics is wrong, and Augustine's argument that you can count Jechonias twice here is false and misleading. So let's look at the names. After they were brought to Babylon, 1, Jechonias begat Selelithel. 2, Selelithel begat Zorobabel. 3, Zorobabel begat Ebiud. And 4, Ebiud begat Eliakim. And 5, Eliakim begat Azor. And 6, Azor begat Zadok. And 7, Zadok begat Akim. 8, Akim begat Eliud. 9, Eliud begat Eleazar. 10, Eleazar begat Mathan. 11, Mathan begat Jacob. And 12, Jacob begat Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom there was a son, and we would call that at least the 13th generation, assuming that's a generation. So it's not 14. So it's wrong again. And it's too short of 42, not just one. So the persons he's fighting and he's claiming are evil and perfidious and traitors and evil people, they were right. He's okay. So now the falsification of the false and phony genealogy of Matthew is great for the Davidic messiahship of Jesus Christ. That's the key. And where do we find that the early church did not have this genealogy and had Jesus begotten by a Davidic person, Joseph, the father of Jesus? Where do we find that? This is covered in Epiphanius in his treatise in the late 300s. And he's talking about the Ebionites, who we now know scholarship has now brought it out much more clearly. The Ebionites are the church of James. This is in Jerome's commentary on Galatians. He says when Paul says, I was told by the main church in Jerusalem to remember the poor there, Jerome says he means the name of the church. The Ebion were known as the poor. So Jerome stuck his nose in it. And so that's clear. I have to take. Okay, so now we're going to explore, is there an alternative? If this person who made the genealogies incorrectly counting, made incorrect calculations, it was 13 in the first group of the 3 groups and 13 in the third group of the 3 groups, and should have been 14 each. Those are mathematical errors that an inspired person could not do. So we know it's not Matthew writing this. Somebody else has written this, and we're going to now investigate. And you're going to see in the end that somebody other than Matthew writes. There's some incongruity in the way the source is using Hebrew texts when Matthew is writing, as like from the Hebrew Bible, but when this other person is writing, they're not using the Hebrew text; they're using Greek text, and so this is dead giveaway that it's a different hand that's doing this work than who wrote the Hebrew Matthew, which became the Greek Matthew. Anyway, so looking at the Hebrew Matthew, the Hebrew original is studied by Epiphanius. Now, Epiphanius is it doesn't like this text because it negates the virgin birth. So I'm going to just show you. He's upset about that. Panarian 30.13.1. He says the Ebionites assert that Jesus was begotten by Joseph, and he claims that as a result, this is incomplete, corrupt, and mutilated. But he doesn't realize, and this is my theory, that what he thinks is corrupt and mutilated is the original Bible, original version of Matthew, but he doesn't realize what really happened is your version had gotten corrupted and interpolated by Marcion and Tatian, who had the money and the capability, the technical ability through the Theodosian. It's a hard name to remember. Theodosian. He had the technical capability. He was a world-renowned expert in translating from Hebrew to Greek, and he was in Origen's Hexapla alongside Symmachus as one of the translators, whose text of the Hebrew Bible was listed in one column, and Symmachus was in another. And then there were other translations that were used as comparison in this guidebook that Oregon had created in the early 200s. Okay, but getting back to it, this is what Epiphanius writes about the Hebrew Matthew, which he acknowledges it's the authentic original with corruptions, including the alleged virgin birth as a corruption. So here's how he starts. But think about how this would correct the problem. For by chopping off the genealogy, so said Epiphanius, of Matthew, they make their gospel, meaning the Ebionites do, begin, as we indicated before, with the words, quote, "And so in the days of Herod, king of Judea, when Caiaphas was high priest, a certain one named John came baptizing a baptism of repentance in the Jordan River." Okay. And by the way, this is amply backed up by Bart Ehrman in his work called Lost Scriptures, books that did not make it into the New Testament. Oxford University Press, 2003. So he's reviewing this. This is his work, repeating this for our benefit. And but, of course, now we're acknowledging that Epiphanius doesn't like the fact that the virgin birth is negated here. And he's living around the late 300s. And this has already been in effect for over 100 some odd years. The virgin birth has been around since 160, 180. Not everywhere. That's the other thing. So if my theory is Marcion creates this competing text, this excites the Ebionites to come out and say, hey, this is a false translation. So there's a battle going on, and this all happens in the late 100s, close to almost 160, 170, 180 AD in that period. So they're fighting, and everybody knows that the Ebionites are doing this, and they're our original church. That was the name of the original church. Nobody can deny that because Jerome even says it. He says in his commentary in Galatians, when Paul said he was told to send money to the poor or help the poor in Jerusalem, he says what it really meant is to help the church name the poor in Jerusalem. Okay, so anyway, let's continue. And now there's problems that are now acknowledged, similar. And in fact, one of the problems I showed you already is acknowledged by conservative Protestant theologians, scholars. Okay. And that one of them, no one can dispute Ben Witherington is conservative as you can possibly get. He wrote a book called New Testament History, A Narrative Account, Baker 2001. And at page 70, he admits that this genealogy in the Greek version of Matthew is problematical. Not only are there incongruities between Matthew and Luke's genealogy, but the Greek Matthew is missing names that belong in the list, which I didn't mention, but he's bringing up, so you need to know there's another problem, which are mentioned in Hebrew scripture, which is incongruent with the number of generations in verse 17. I'll explain that in a minute. Now, this problem could also be solved by equally for going back to the Ebionite version and say, hey, well, let's go back to the way it originally was. There was no genealogy. Okay, so Ben Witherington explains in his book at page 70, while the list in the Greek version of Matthew counts out a number of generations in each of three periods, it omits the names of three kings of Judah, Ahaziah, Joash, and Amaziah, and hence is inaccurate in the number given. So imagine you've got three groups and there's three names missing, and just theoretically they could be one in each group. So the count saying there's 14 generations were off by not mentioning who these other three. So the total should have been three greater than it was. So you would add three names in and you would have the accurate totals. But whoever this was didn't know that and skipped names. And since they gave finite numbers of 14 and 14 and 14, they were wrong, just as an absolute term. So they just didn't know the Bible well enough. That could not be Matthew. That could not be Matthew under inspiration. But it gets a little worse. Okay. Now, the work by Davis Young and Ralph Sterling entitled The Bible, Rocks and Time, Geological Evidence for the Age of the Earth, InterVarsity Press, 2008 at 168, points out what I pointed out about the third grouping of names. Also in the last segment, this is the segment Jesus is in, of the 14 generations, the number is actually 13th, hence a mathematical mistake. So there you go. That's a validation of what I told you already. And so that can't be an inspired person who put that in there. Somebody else put it in there. Okay. Now we're going to see and study a scholar who's going to tell us what supports the idea that the Ebionite version is more accurate for us to use, taking into account that there could be some interpolations. They probably did for reliable and good reasons, meaning they made some changes and corrections. So when Matthew originally wrote it, maybe somebody wanted that Peter said, "Hey, I want to add a little commentary. I want to add something there." It's not bad to interpolate things if it's coming from the apostles. And the other thing he points out is the Ebionite Matthew actually does have Matthew talking in certain places where it's him talking, but he talks about himself in the third person. But in other verses, in a lot of verses, it's the whole group of apostles talking. So they're talking as a group. So it wouldn't be unexpected that they would come into the library at Caesarea where the Hebrew Matthew was kept, and they could go in and add interpolations by permission. And this was kept in a special place that Christians had control over this particular library because of the custodians. Okay. So his name of this book is Johann David Michaelis, Introduction to the New Testament, translated by Herbert Marsh. This is a scholar from Prussia, meaning he speaks German. And a little bit of background. He was a Prussian biblical scholar and teacher. He was a member of a family who was committed to solid discipline in Hebrew and the cognate languages, which distinguished the University of Halle in the period of Pietism. He was a member of the Göttingen School of History. And he seemed to me, just knowing a lot about the Hebrew Matthew, I've studied a lot about it. He's kind of gone into more depth than almost anybody else. So to me, he's a must read for anyone who's making a serious, trying to understand the Hebrew Matthew in a serious way, because he did a lot of homework. He spent at least 30, 40 pages I read tonight just on the Hebrew Matthew, and he knows it in depth and all the scholarship and all the ins and outs of it. So we're going to get I'm going to just highlight a couple of things, but mostly to focus in on this issue about the genealogy. Okay. Then he's going to, we're going to skip this for now. Let's just move on a little bit here. I want you to see it in the original print. So actually, when I first saw this, it was an 1823 edition. I typed up what was there, or I maybe did a electronic copy of the text. But regardless, it's good. But I want you to see the actual pages from scans, so you can see it's real. It's not somebody transferring it into electronic form. So we're going to start at page 174. So now this is going to cover 174 through 194. I'm not going to go over every page, but I'm going to highlight a few things as we go. Of the gospel used by the Ebionites, we have hardly any other information than that which has been given by Epiphanius, who is an ecclesiastical writer, and he was far from being of the first class, and as a critic must be referred to as the lowest class. So he's not a great critic. Kind of an excitable person, if you ask me too, yeah. But on the other hand, he had the advantage that he was a native of Palestine and understood Hebrew, which, by the way, in this era, the scholarship was tended to be, if you weren't Greek or Latin, we don't have anybody who knew Hebrew other than Jerome later. So Jerome is in the late 300s. So is this gentleman. So in terms of scholarship that eventually rises, it's going to be people who don't seem to know Hebrew, and that's going to be key to preserve certain facts about our Bible. Okay, and then he says it is highly probable that he himself had in his possession a copy of the gospel used by the Ebionites, because he's quoting so many different passages, and he makes references to like the whole book. And I mean, it's not that long a book if you really think about it. So yeah, it's not that unlikely. And he then makes several extracts and he puts them in the Panarion, which is a term that means medicine box. And he's fighting against heresies, and he's claiming there's some heresies. And he doesn't like the attack on the virgin birth account, for example. So that's neither here nor there. We're trying to find out, do the genealogies belong? Okay, so now the Ebion omit the genealogy, According to Epiphanius, the gospel of the Ebionites was different from the gospel of the Nazarenes, for he describes the former as having an uncorrupted, the latter a very corrupted text. So this is not about whether they. I think neither one of them, the Nazarene Hebrew Matthew and the Ebionite Hebrew Matthew, both don't have the genealogies, but the difference here is the gospel of the Ebionites was less corrupted than the Nazarene, according to Epiphanius. Now, he could be wrong, and he's maybe judging that based on factors that he's prejudiced. So who knows? All right, now he's going to give us a couple of passages where Epiphanius quotes from the gospel of the Ebionites. The first passage appears to have been a kind of preface to the Ebionite gospel. Oh, and so I just found a couple little details I wanted us to know. When he speaks of himself, Matthew, in this book, he speaks in the third person. I mentioned that, and that begins at chapter 9 of this book, verse 9. So people have gone through and put in chapter and verses after the fact. But this passage is written in the name of several in the first person plural. So what he means is the opening passage is in the first person plural, meaning we. First person plural is we. So it's all the apostles apparently are talking in communion together. It was perhaps designed as a general preface in the name of the 12 apostles. For the Ebionite gospel had, among other names, that of the gospel of the apostles. So sometimes Justin Martyr will say, I'm looking at the memoir of the apostles. And a lot of people say they don't know what that is. And this scholar points out, if you knew the details about the interior structure of the Gospel of Matthew, you'd see that it has the apostles talking more commonly than even Matthew does directly to the audience who's reading. So it could easily be interpreted by Justin Martin as not the Gospel of Matthew, but it would be the Gospel of the Apostles. And he calls it the Memoir of the Apostles about 20 times. So we should probably raise the standard and say when Justin Martin does that, those are direct quotes of the same work, because this little detail that and I've only found this in Michaelis, he's the only one who highlighted this. So now you can drag out all the Justin Martyr quotes and say definitively it's nothing different than what is the Hebrew Matthew that Jerome and Epiphanius and others quote. All right, and then a funny detail, and I'm going to just bring this up and not go through all the slides, but he's mentioning that what Epiphanius notes is that the gospel of the Matthew gospel has this detail that misses or doesn't mention the locusts that John the Baptist eats, and instead mentions manna, which translates as honey cakes. And it's mentioned a couple times here, and he has a whole chapter on it. I mean, literally a whole page in a footnote on this. And what he thinks is that maybe this is a corruption by mistake in the Hebrew Matthew going from Greek into Hebrew. But it's very definitively now been shown it's the other way around. So the original version of our Greek text was looking at the word for manna, and when you translate that into Greek, it's a one-letter difference between the word locust and a word for honey cake or manna. The translation of manna should be honey cake. And so one of the words is herba and the other is arba. And I think herba would have been the honey cake, but it was put down as arba and it came out as locust. But going the other way around doesn't work. If you took the word for locust in Hebrew, you would never make a mistake and translate it as manna, because the word spellings are so far apart from each other. So you can tell that this is the original of our Bible, of our Hebrew Matthew. Excuse me, the Hebrew Matthew must be the original of our Greek, because that translation mistake that Epiphanius is pointing out proves that the Hebrew Matthew came first, and that's how it went from manna. It should have been herba, but it came out as arba, and that's how you get a manna turns into a honey cake in Greek, and it should have been honey cake, but it got translated as locust by a one-letter mistake. See, so this is really gold, but he doesn't know this yet. This is scholarship that Mr. Tabor put in his recent book, and he put it in a footnote. It was like It's a gold, and he should have put a whole page on it, maybe a chapter on it. I thought it was so important to know this is our original Bible. This is our original gospel that we originally was translated into our New Testament Greek Matthew. And according to Evans, this was also the source for the book of Luke when he was preparing for Theophilus' version of our scripture. I'm going to take a pause here, and we'll be right back. Okay, and the author Michaelis wants us to know that Eusebius actually had a pretty high view of the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, that it was on the same level with other works that are canonical, meaning are inside of our Bible, the Epistle of Jude, the Second Peter, Second and Third John, and the Book of Revelation, which were questioned. So this book was questioned at the same level as any of those, and they made it into the canon, but this one didn't. So you see, that's how close it came. And we don't even know why. If Eusebius blessed it, why didn't this work that we're talking about come in there? And that would have been great. We could have seen it, but now it's lost in history. It wasn't preserved properly. All right. Okay, so what I want to show you is that let's see something here. Oh, and what's also interesting at page 189 is that this work was, he says, in the majority of Christians. Okay, however, its name and character were not unknown in the early church, though it is difficult to determine what the majority of Christians in the three first centuries thought of it, because Eusebius has expressed himself in ambiguous terms. Okay, so that's our only knowledge. He's positive, but he's not 100%, but he's saying it's in that level I told you of authority. But by the 5th century, now things had gone up. Now, 5th century means the 400s, and that's when the opinion of this started to get elevated by the fact of what Epiphanius wrote, by the fact of what Jerome wrote, which were generally still positive, even though they were both pointing out there's apparently adulterations, which really was it doesn't match all our doctrines, in particular the virgin birth. In the 5th century, most persons believed it to be the original of St. Matthew's Gospel, but whether they knew that it was interpolated and distinguished the genuine text from its additions, we are not informed. So, but that's what he's saying, is that this had become accepted within the church as acceptable at the same level as Jude. Oh, I failed to mention the same as Jude, James, the Book of Revelation, and Second Peter, and Second and Third John, the epistles. So this is kind of shocking that it didn't make it into the canon, frankly. Okay, Epiphanius, who I was quoting earlier, describes the Nazarene Gospel as St. Matthew's original, but he does not appear to have seen it himself, and therefore he probably followed common opinion. So there's the Ebionite Gospel of Matthew, and then there's the Nazarene Gospel of Matthew. And presumably they're very similar to each other, but they're not exactly the same. So the Ebionite Gospel is what Epiphanius was more familiar with. Okay, and Jerome refers to the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew as St. Matthew's original. And one time he refers to it in a disrespectful manner, but most of the time he's not. He'll say, but when he did so, he was referring to the interpolations that he believed. Of course, if it has a virgin birth and you believe the virgin birth is correct, then you're going to call it interpolation. It's a corruption. So this is what I don't think they had any conception of how that could have happened. So that's why they're not able to process that part of the equation. Okay, so I'm going to pause for a minute. Okay, in his conclusion, beginning at page 190, about what the quality of the work he's looking at is, by his report, meaning Jerome's, I shall abide and shall consider the Nazarene Gospel as St. Matthew's original, augmented indeed with many additions, which, though they are so far spurious that they did not proceed from the pen of St. Matthew, who wrote the Gospel itself, were derived probably from good authority. So even though Jerome was saying that he accepted this as the original and there were emendations or changes, yet still they were coming from a good authority. They weren't really true corruptions in that sense of being from a bad place. They just simply were maybe the apostles or other sources that were now being added in time to the text. So that's why he's taking this as a legitimate competitor to have been in the canon, just didn't, for some reason, didn't make it. Probably because of the virgin birth issue. Because if it says Joseph begat Jesus, well, we're going to see they're going to purge all those books out of existence. So that's par for the course. Okay, and he says absolute certainty on this subject cannot be expected, since Jerome's translation, as well as the Hebrew gospel itself, is unfortunately lost. We must therefore be content ourselves with probabilities. Okay, and then he's going to show that, actually there's an example of where just looking at the text and what Jerome had preserved in his commentary is where it says in the Lord's Prayer, give us this day our daily bread. It actually doesn't say that. When you look at the Hebrew Matthew, it says, give us our bread for tomorrow. And that kind of is a good way of praying too about it, right? So that's what it more accurately does say. And even they realized once they saw it in Hebrew, they said, you know what? The word in Greek actually has two meanings, and one of them is tomorrow. So so the Greek translation actually is correct. It's just our perception of what meaning it had was not as narrow as the original Hebrew word, which is only tomorrow. So, but by seeing the Hebrew word, you go, okay, now we know it really means, of the two choices, it means tomorrow. Thank you, Lord. Give us tomorrow's bread today is what we're praying for. Interesting. So then he's going to say, based on that, he's going to suggest we need to give this thing some help to tell us whether these first two chapters should be taken out completely out of the New Testament. He's going to say it would be a good idea. He wouldn't blame anybody if they wanted to do that. Now, before I read you that quote, I want to tell you he's going to reference someone named Tatian, has the Hebrew Matthew. He's familiar with the Hebrew Matthew, and he's going to do what's called a document called the Ditessaron. That means through four. So he's going to take four versions of the gospel texts and combine them one next to each other. And in that version, he is telling us what the Hebrew Matthew looked like to him, or Matthew, but he's familiar with the Hebrew Matthew. So it's probably the Hebrew Matthew he's looking at. And this man dies in 173 AD. So one of the oldest Bibles kept a copy of is the Diatessaron by Tatian. And this gospel, and by the way, it was in Syriac form, meaning in Aramaic. So it's close to the actual language of Hebrew. And guess what? It doesn't have the genealogy at all. So now, then let me add here that Latin versions influenced the gospel text. Tatian also founded or at least was closely associated with the heretical sect of Encratites, a community integrating a severe asceticism with elements of Stoic philosophy. Okay, so and I'm just mentioning this so people are aware, the Encratites were opponents of Paul. Okay, so maybe, that has something to do with it. I just want you to know. But it also tells you, why are these people opposing Paul? They keep coming up. The Ebionites oppose Paul. The Encratites oppose Paul. The people who are trying to preserve the original text are people who oppose Paul. And so, just bear that in mind. The legitimate voices in history are being mentioned, and that one of them is Tatian. So the mention in the Britannica about the Encratites is this. Eusebius of Caesarea stated in his 4th century history, that's 130 years later after Tatian was involved in Encratites, he says of the church that the Encratites at that time actually rejected both the Pauline letters and the Acts of the Apostles. And what did I tell you earlier is the Ebionites and apparently the Encratites both accepted Luke's gospel and the Greek Matthew. Of course, they would accept the Hebrew Matthew. But they rejected the Acts of the Apostles, and I've explained to you why, because that's not written for Christians. It's not because it glorifies Paul. It's that it even sends a bad message about what Paul stands for, meaning Paul's endorsing believing that the temple is not made of human. God does not live in temples made of human hands. I mean, it makes even Paul look like a heretic, and like we had this wild person in the church that we were tolerating. And so, but we had to put this presentation together for the Nero because this was an appellate brief, and the church needed to win because Nero could outlaw. The fate of Christianity was at stake. Nero could not just simply convict Paul, he could outlaw Christianity. So winning this case involved exposing things even about Paul that we might not like Christians to know was true about Paul, but we needed everybody to know. So Paul's quoting Dionysius in a play. That's not something we want Christians to know that Paul did, because that's a very bad thing for Paul to do, to equate Jesus to the Dionysius god. So, but we're going to include it in there. And, there are other factors that, Paul says in there, the angels. He quotes. There's a quotation Paul is relaying from Stephen, supposedly saying that the angels gave the law. Well, that's a way of denigrating the entire law and throwing it all out. It wasn't given by God; it was given by angels. Things like this. This is stuff that would appeal to pagans and brings shows a religious picture that pagans would tolerate and find more palatable, and that was key, that we wouldn't get outlawed. We had to look like we could fit in with the religions, and Paul gave all kinds of crazy ideas that God does not live in temples made of human hands, which is a principle of paganism, but not of our Bible. That's in Acts 17, verse 17, ladies and gentlemen. And most importantly, the Python priestess in Acts 16:16 is endorsing Paul. So these are things that would appeal to pagans, but totally be abhorrent to Christians if they, who were alive in that era and knew who the Python priestess was. So these were things we didn't want anyone to know, and we didn't want anyone to be exposed to think that any Christian leader could ever be involved in these demonic activities with the Python priestess and being endorsed by her and tolerating it and all this kind of stuff. So we've covered that in many other videos. So there was a good reason why they were saying, do not read the book of Acts. It's not for you. It was meant for pagans. And so, but anyway, but Tatian is going to eliminate or not have the genealogies, as we'll see. So here's what he says. He's going to say at page 192, the preceding example, the example of the daily bread, doesn't say daily bread, it means tomorrow's bread, may serve as a specimen of the exegetical use which might be made of the Nazarene gospel, were it now extant. To illustrate its critical use in determining the authenticity of spuriousness of doubtful passages, we may apply it to the two first chapters of St. Matthew's Gospel, on which doubts are entertained whether they really proceeded from the pen of the evangelist. So saying, look at the fact that we showed you the daily bread error. It's really the tomorrow's bread is very useful. So this, going back to this original text, which is clearly the original of our Greek text, we are gaining some insight that we wouldn't otherwise had, right? And that's a treasure to know what Jesus really meant. Well, what about the fact that this didn't have the genealogy? Isn't that a treasure we can go back to and then get rid of these very erroneous genealogies, which are bad? And you're going to see there's a lot more he's going to expose. I just scratched the surface. It appears from the accounts of Epiphanius, which have already been quoted. Give me a second here. That in the Hebrew gospel used by the Ebionites, the genealogy was certainly wanting, so meaning it wasn't there. And the genealogy was certainly wanting. So you got to go down 4 lines here. And perhaps the whole of the 2 first chapters are missing. Tatian, likewise, who was said to have used the Hebrew gospel, omitted the genealogy. So again, he's laying out in the Tessaron this list of the 4 gospels. He has the Matthew gospel, and he doesn't have the genealogy. He's following the Hebrew gospel, and so that's what he was understood. He was using the Hebrew gospel to create his Dia Tessaron. Then it's also in the 2 capitulations and a breviary published by Martiane. It is wholly unnoticed, and it's missing in the Codex Ebionitensis, which I've described in the catalog of the Greek manuscripts. So I haven't looked into that, so that's something to investigate further. But it begins St. Matthew's Gospel with the 18th verse of the first chapter. So that skips over all the problems. You don't have that problem. Now, this is what was interesting to me that I think striking. There are likewise internal marks which render it at least doubtful whether the genealogy was written by the same person who wrote the rest of the Gospel. For instance, verse 6 is copied, contrary to the common custom in St. Matthew's Gospel, not from the Hebrew. In other words, when Matthew is borrowing text and copying it from the Hebrew Bible, he uses the Hebrew of the Hebrew Bible to then make a translation, a fresh translation. But if you're somebody other than Matthew, you would maybe just go to the Septuagint Greek translation made by the Egyptians back in 257 BC, and that's being kept alive. But those translations are always very different because they didn't know what they were doing. The Septuagint is a very corrupt, bad translation. So you need people like Symmachus, you need people like Theodotion to fix all these things, and that you would find complete variance between that. In this instance, these passages of Ruth from chapter 4, verse 22 of the book of Chronicles in Hebrew is very different than Septuagint. And in this uh, uh, version of the ancestors, the genealogy, the person is taking it from the Septuagint, which the Hebrew Matthew never does. And Jerome even told the Pope at one point, he says, you know what, we need to reconsider whether we should be using the Septuagint Bible to understand the Hebrew Bible. And so he said, Matthew never quotes the Septuagint. He always quotes the Hebrew Bible, and he translates it. Or excuse me, he uses the Hebrew Bible, and then Jerome wants to translate from the Hebrew Bible, and make a correct translation, not use the Septuagint Greek. But he tells the Pope, and the Pope says, you know what? If it's good enough for our Apostle Paul to use the Septuagint, we should just use the Septuagint. So that's how a word, for example, Isaiah 7, where it talks about in Hebrew, it talks about an Alma, a young woman is going to have a child. And Jerome is saying, I want to translate that as a young woman into Greek. And the Pope is saying, no, if it was good enough for Paul to use the Septuagint, you use the Septuagint. The Septuagint translated young woman is Parthenos in Greek, and that means a virgin, not a young woman. So that's how it would be translated, so that but that was probably also the intent of whoever drafted this, to make it look that way. And so but the point here is this, is that if that's what the purpose of the most common practice of the Hebrew Matthew was to use the original Hebrew, and therefore we should translate it from that original Hebrew into Greek that corresponds to those words, and not use the Septuagint. So this is proof that whoever was doing this and made the Greek texts of these genealogies was using the Septuagint, and therefore they're not following the practice of Matthew. So that this is a signature that proves that the same person is not involved in both preparing the Greek Matthew, and the Greek Matthew is different than the genealogy Greek. Okay, so they're translated two different ways. One's using the Hebrew into Greek, and the other's using the Greek Septuagint translation, which is consistently so bad you can see it like a sore thumb. Stands out as a sore thumb. Let's put it that way, and you can see the mistakes. And he gives you the exact example. You can actually see here the Hebrew is just simply these words, those little letters. I don't know Hebrew, but he's making it sound like it's obvious to anybody who can see that, and it's not the same to translate that the way it was translated into Greek. Okay, and then he says this, page 193 of his volume 3. No two chapters in the whole New Testament are pressed with so many difficulties as the two in question, for chapters 1 and 2. Not so much on account of the apparent contradictions to the genealogy given by St. Luke, which may be very satisfactorily reconciled, as on the account of the quotations contained in them from the Old Testament, which I am wholly unable to explain. He says, I can reconcile it, but I can't explain it. The account likewise given chapter 1, verse 5, that Rahab was the mother of Boaz. So this is very interesting. And I've never heard this before. And consequently, that David was descended from her appears to be very uncertain, because in the genealogical table of David's ancestors, which is given in the book of Ruth, I'll give you the sites below in a minute, and in the first book of Chronicles, no mention is made of any such person as Rahab, nor is it said in the book of Joshua, where the history of Rahab is related, that she married the father of Boaz. Since therefore the Old Testament is silent on this subject, the writer of the genealogy could have derived his information from no other source than Jewish tradition. But we find no such report among the Jewish writers. On the contrary, it appears that the quotations made by Wettstein, that among the descendants of Rahab were several priests, whence we might suppose that she married rather into the tribe of Levi than into the tribe of Judah. Should any critic, therefore, in consequence of these difficulties, be disposed to separate the two first chapters from the rest of St. Matthew's Gospel in order to prevent the objections which may be made to them from affecting the credibility and inspiration of the whole Gospel, I should not censure him. I'm going to leave it there. There's a lot more we can go into. All right, and I guess that's it. I think we finished this treatment, and I hope this will help you to realize that the this original portion of Matthew, the text of the genealogy, was not written by the Apostle Matthew, could not, has so many errors in it. You also saw that the textual signature is somebody other than Matthew. It's somebody who was relying on the Septuagint Greek translation from Hebrew into Greek, instead of relying upon a reasonably normal translation from Hebrew into Greek, which is completely unlike the Septuagint nonsense that these Egyptian translators in 257 BC did not know what they were doing. Very bad translation. I think anybody who knows anything about Greek would just simply say it's a clear, obvious. It's obvious. There's a signature. There's a fingerprint if you're using one or the other, and that's what sets it off. And then you also have this issue about Boaz. You have the number count wrong. So there's just so many things stepping out and proving beyond reasonable doubt in my mind that the genealogy is not original. And now if the genealogy isn't original, that supports my view too, that the next verse after the genealogy is not original, because that's really part of the genealogy, because it removes Joseph as the father of Jesus. So it's intricately connected. And so it should fall too. And we would then say, okay, what was the original? We already saw Epiphanius said that Joseph was the father of Jesus according to the book of the Hebrew Matthew that he was reading from the Ebionites. We need to go back to that. And it's supported by Justin Martin. It's supported by the oldest Bible that was found, called the Sinaitic Plimset, and it's called the Curitan Bible, or the Syriac Curitan Bible. So that's we have all the grounds to go back and fix this and bring back our Bible back to where it should be. So we would eliminate the genealogies completely in Matthew. We would put back the verse, and really it originally just simply said Joseph begat Jesus, and didn't have any genealogy. So that verse has to be restored back where it belongs, and nothing else built on top of it. And that's it, because that proves a Davidic heir. Joseph was a Davidic heir. And by him, and probably, if you think about it, the story of them going to the town of David, a town of Bethlehem, that would tell all you need to know. Joseph was part of the Davidic Davidic line, and so he did what he's supposed to do, and he has a child through Mary. Period. That's it. That's no big deal. And that's how Jesus came in existence as a human being. And just bear with it, and instead of resist this, embrace it, because if he doesn't have Joseph as a father, doesn't have a Davidic lineage, he can't be the Messiah. And that's in 1 Samuel, I think it's 1 Samuel 5, where it says repeatedly, he must be of the flesh of David. And so you can't get that by some sort of birth from above. You have to go through the process of human procreation to do that. So, and the whole point of mentioning Joseph, the line of the line, even in the Matthew corrupt version, whoever's doing that corruption realizes you're trying to prove that Jesus's father is Joseph, and you just stop one short for no obvious reason. It just doesn't make any sense. Okay, so I hope this helps everybody to get a better idea of how the Bible has been changed, when it probably changed, who probably changed it. We're still working on that to prove that, but we know that it was changed from what it originally was. And now we're getting close to figuring out how to fix these things. And that means getting back to what was as authentic a part of Scripture as the book of Revelation, as authentic as the book of Jude, as authentic as the book of James, as authentic as Second Peter, as authentic as what else? James, Jude, Revelation. He had a couple of others in there. And Second and Third John. So, these were the outlier versions of things. So we should it's too bad now we can't find it. But if it ever popped out of the ground like the Dead Sea Scrolls, we should restore it to where it belongs. But we can reconstruct it, and that's what we're doing. And piece by piece, we'll bring it back, and it should then form and guide us on how to understand our faith, and that it is true. Whether we have to reconstruct it doesn't matter. If it's true, it's you make the effort to reconstruct and restore a text that should have been there all along. All right, God bless everybody. Good night. Take care. Ciao. Bye.